Welcome to the Animagination podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of your favourite animes, uncovering the stories, characters, and creativity that make these shows and movies so impactful and so unforgettable. I'm Cameron, and later we'll be joined by Helen McCarthy, who'll be our guide on today's adventure. Today, we're flying off to explore one of the biggest, most beloved anime studios of all time, Studio Ghibli. To talk about the birth of Studio Ghibli, we have to go back to the 1970s, before Ghibli even existed. Its legendary founders, Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, were already working in animation. Miyazaki had been an animator for years, working on shows like Future Boy Conan in 1978, and Takahata was known for his work directing Heidi, Girl of the Alps in 1974. The two of them first teamed up on a film called Nausicaa Valley of the Wind in 1984. Now, this movie was a game changer. It was based on Miyazaki's own manga, and it introduced so many themes that would define Ghibli. Strong female leads, environmentalism, stunning world building. It was a hit in Japan, and it caught the attention of producer Toshio Suzuki, who saw its potential. After Nausicaa, the three, Miyazaki, Takahata, and Suzuki, decided to create their own animation studio, and in 1985, Studio Ghibli was officially born. Studio Ghibli's first official movie was Laputa Castle in the Sky in 1986. If you haven't seen it, it's an epic adventure about a lost floating city, and it still holds up beautifully today. But things really took off in 1988, when Ghibli released My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies on the same day. Now think about that for a second. Two of the most powerful animated films ever, one a heartwarming fantasy, the other a gut-wrenching war drama, both dropping on April 16th, 1988. My Neighbor Totoro gave the world its most famous Ghibli mascot, the big, fluffy Totoro himself. It's a simple, gentle story about two sisters who move to the countryside and discover magical forest spirits. No grand conflict, no villains, just pure childhood wonder. And then, on the complete opposite end, you have Grave of the Fireflies, directed by Takahata, which is one of the most heartbreaking war films ever made. If you've seen it, you know. If you haven't, prepare yourself. These two films set the tone for Ghibli's identity, beauty, emotion, and storytelling that sticks with you. As the 90s rolled in, Ghibli kept pushing the boundaries of animation. 1992's Porco Rosso gave us a fighter pilot who's also a pig? Yeah, weird concept, but it works. Then came Whisper of the Heart in 1995, a coming-of-age film that introduces the Baron, who would later return in The Cat Returns. But the big moment came in 1997 with Princess Mononoke. This movie was a game changer, darker, more intense, and deeply philosophical. It was one of the first anime films to really make a splash internationally. And just a few years later, in 2001, Ghibli reached the peak of its global success with Spirited Away. Now, Spirited Away wasn't just a hit, it dominated. It became the highest grossing film in Japan for nearly 2 decades, won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, and solidified Ghibli's reputation as a world-class studio. Even today, people still call it one of the greatest animated films ever made. After Spirited Away, Ghibli continued making stunning films. Howl's Moving Castle in 2004 gave us gorgeous steampunk fantasy, and Ponyo from 2008 brought back that classic childhood magic. But in 2013, Miyazaki announced his retirement after The Wind Rises, his semi-biographical film about a World War II aircraft designer. Ghibli actually halted production for a while, and it felt like the studio's future was uncertain. Then came When Marnie Was There in 2014, a beautifully emotional film, but for a while it seemed like it might be Ghibli's last. Then, in 2017, something amazing happened. Miyazaki came out of retirement. He announced he was working on a new film called The Boy and the Heron, How Do You Live, in Japan. The movie finally released in 2023, and it was everything fans had hoped for. Visually stunning, deeply emotional, and packed with signature Ghibli magic. Meanwhile, Ghibli continues to thrive. They even opened Ghibli Park in 2022, a theme park in Japan dedicated to their films. It's like stepping straight into their world, with recreations of iconic places from Spirited Away, My Neighbor Totoro, and more. So why does Ghibli have such a lasting impact? It's the way their movies feel like living, breathing worlds. They don't just tell stories, they invite you into them. They embrace quiet moments, celebrate the beauty of nature, and treat animation as a true art form. Whether it's the whimsical magic of Kiki's Delivery Service, the heartbreaking realism of Grave of the Fireflies, or the epic adventure of Castle in the Sky, there's a Ghibli film for everyone. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear what our expert has to say. I'm just a fan, so I invited author and anime historian Helen McCarthy to talk to me today about Studio Ghibli. And generous as she is, she said yes. So, Helen, for those at home who don't already know, who are you and what do you do?
Well, it's a weird thing to realise that just as people don't necessarily know classic anime, they also don't necessarily know classic anime fans or anime scholars or anime writers. So where I started was in 1981, when I first became aware that anime, Japanese animation, existed as a separate entity within animation. And where I've gone since then is I started to write about it because nobody else was writing about it in the UK. Did the first book in English and then just didn't stop. And so ever since then, I've been a writer about anime. I've co-founded a magazine, edited it in another magazine, run a whole slew of public access events like cinema seasons at the Barbican and speeches at other places. And what I do now is I spend most of my work time either writing about anime and manga or speaking about anime and manga, which is a lot of fun.
So, you've been in this pretty much since the start then, at least here. And I know obviously a lot of your focus is on Studio Ghibli, but what about anime in general? How did you get started there?
Well, in 1981, I met a guy and we're still together. So that's quite a long time. But he had just come back from a graduation trip with a group of his friends who'd all graduated together in fine art and illustration and graphic design. And because they were all art oriented, they were very clued in to anything that presented a new way of looking at things or a new style of rendering things in art. So when they went off together on their graduation trip to Mallorca, which is an island that's part of Spain, they saw some anime late at night on Spanish TV. So then when they got back and I met Steve and we started to go around together, he told me about this wonderful stuff that they'd found on their holiday that was a completely different way of storytelling visually. And I looked at it, and what really got me about it was that I was looking at manga by Go Nagai and various other people. And although I spoke no Spanish, read no Spanish, and of course didn't read or speak Japanese, I could read the story. Not the details of the story, but the outline of the story was quite clear from the graphic presentation. And I've always been all about story. And I thought, if this is another way that you can present stories without needing the filter of words or even of language that you understand, if people can follow the outline of the story just from the outlines on the page or on the screen, that is a great thing.
So what were they? The first anime you saw, I mean. The one that gave you this view of anime. What was it about them that caught your attention so much?
The first anime I saw, the first 2 or 3 anime I saw, I think. The first one was Mazinger Z in Spanish. The second one was Mobile Suit Gundam and Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam. And the third one was a wonderful thing called Leda Fantastic Adventures of Yoko. And I managed to see them because I'd been to a French convent school, and France, along with Spain and Italy, had got anime and manga in 78. So I knew a little bit about anime and manga from French friends and school friends, and I also was a Trekkie. And that meant I had huge American contacts because Trek fandom was this great international sisterhood that kept in touch with each other. So I managed to see those 3. Leda was an original animation video, an OVA. I must have seen that 87, 88. No, actually, Leda wasn't the first. It was an OVA called Birth that I saw first. And it was really interesting because I saw that quite early on. It was the second animation ever made for video release. And it was really interesting and dense and quite deep and psychological and chewy. But it was also made available a couple of years later on a kids' video label for under 5s, which was sublimely inappropriate. And I happened to work for the company that was doing it at the time. So those three gave me, first of all, three very different styles to work with. Because if you look at Mazinger Z, at Tomino's Gundam, particularly the early Gundam, which was very hard science, very Lagrange cylinders and mobile suits made to think about them functioning as engines, as machinery, and Birth, which was totally off the wall and a fantastically drug-addled dream of psychology and drama and action and adventure and mysticism. They were totally different in style, they were totally different in pace, they were totally different in tone. And what that said to me straight away is that this subset of animation, these people in Japan, realize that you can do absolutely anything in animation. You can do anything you want. You don't have to be confined by one style, like maybe Disney is. You don't have to be confined by one set of subject matter. You can just do whatever you like with it, because as long as you've got color, cells, paper, pencils, anything you can draw, you can have. Doesn't matter what it is. And that, I just found that incredibly exciting, that there were actually no limits in the mayhem and the chaos and the reflectiveness that you could have in animation, just as long as you were willing to draw it.
That's a really good way to put it, I think. I like the sentiment that you can have anything that you can imagine. But segueing into something else that makes full use of the wonders of animation, Studio Ghibli. So how did you first find out about them? What got you into Ghibli?
Steve and I, my partner and I, spent a lot of time talking to people about anime and how great it was, and pushing as far as we could to build an audience. Because one of the things that many publishers said to me is there is no audience that would buy a book like this. There's no market for it at the moment anywhere in the English-speaking world. So we thought, okay, let's get out there and build whatever we can in the way of an audience. And one of the things that we tried to do was to get involved with a convention that would be willing to give us some space to show anime to a large group of people. We were showing anime to a few people in our living room on alternate Sundays in the afternoon. We thought a convention, a really big convention, if we could get our hands on that would let us show anime to 1,000 people at a time. That would be something. And I was asked to help with the bid for the 1990 World Science Fiction Convention. Not World Science Fiction Convention, I'm sorry, 1990 British Science Fiction Convention. Now, the British Science Fiction Convention is held every year at Easter, so it's called the EasterCon. And we actually got it. We actually won the bid and put the con together. And one of the things that I was finally able to do was to put together an anime program with quite a bit of help from various people. So we went to all our friends and said, we're putting out this program for British science fiction and fantasy fans at the National Annual Convention. We'd like you to send us the funkiest, wildest stuff you've got in anime. And we got about 300 hours of video on tape coming through our letterbox day in, day out. There are a few tapes that we actually had to get sent again because they weren't very well packed, and when they fell through the letterbox onto the floor, videotape can crack. You can lose the cassette and they weren't all salvageable. But we got this astonishing amount of anime, and Steve and I sat down with the help of some of our weekend friends who came to view to watch it and filter it down to, we eventually got, I think, 35 hours. Now that meant that we could show about 1 in 10 videos that we had. And we had My Neighbor Totoro. And Totoro came out in the summer of 1988. And it was in the winter of 1989 that I got a copy through the post from a friend. It was a camera copy, bit shaky, colour a bit fallouty, no subtitles. But I looked at it and I thought, we've really got to get a showable version of this. So I wrote back and forth to various friends and got a videotape that had better video and subtitles on it, and we showed that. What appealed to me about Totoro, and what still appeals to me about Totoro, because it is my favourite film of all time in any medium, by any director, is that there is not a frame of it that you could remove that would benefit the film. Every single frame is perfect in that every single frame does exactly the job that it needs to do to advance the film, to advance the director's ideas. And there are very few films about which you can say that. And I think that's what impressed me about Ghibli. It was Totoro. I thought, I need to know more about the people that made this and why they made it and how they made it. I need to know more because this is a perfect artifact. And I want to find out more about where it came from and how it came into being.
So, with you having such strong feelings about Totoro, every frame being perfect, like you said, do you think that changed your perspective on other anime, or even just other media as a whole?
I don't think so. I think what it has given me, what Ghibli has given me, is an absolute standard of technical quality. When you watch anything that's really good, and I mean, Ghibli is uneven, let's not pretend differently. There are Ghibli directors who are better than other Ghibli directors. There are Ghibli directors who've got particular strengths that are far above that of other directors, but are deficient in other areas. And there are Ghibli films that are not so well made as Totoro. But taken overall, I think Ghibli presents a really high level of excellence in every area of filmmaking. For instance, it's one of the very few places in the world where they can actually execute everything from the initial conception all the way through to principal photography in-house in the same team. And that's quite something. That gives you a continuity that you don't get everywhere. And when I looked at Ghibli, I realized that there were different ways of approaching this and different ways of considering this. So, did they change my perspective on other series? No. Did they change my perspective on what could be achieved? Yes. I will look at every series on its own merits. I don't look at them and compare them with Ghibli or Disney. I sometimes compare them with live action film, actually, depending on what the series is. But I try and approach everything from the point of view that somebody made this to make money, yes, and to have fun and give other people a good time. How far do they succeed? How well does the whole melange work together? How well does the sound sync? How well do the sound effects sync? How well do they work with the imagery? I will think about that. And in most cases, Ghibli does the tiny things. Running on grass isn't the same as running on pavement, isn't the same as running on roof tiles, isn't the same as running on a treadmill in a gym. Every single form of running has different physical configurations, different sound effects, different noises, different weight configurations, how you animate somebody's feet when they're running. The feet splay differently if they're running faster or slower. And even if the feet are in shoes, the shoes will deform. Now, not everybody goes into that level of detail because not everybody can afford it. But when you're looking at a film where you see all that happening properly and it's been thought through properly, that obviously affects how you think about other films. And then you have to say to yourself, the animation in this film compared with the animation in that film, or the animation in this series compared with the animation in that movie, there's no comparison.
When Ghibli sets such a high standard for other animation and other studios to strive for, how would you describe the impact that they had on the anime industry?
Within the anime industry, we've got to draw lines. The anime industry in Japan is a different beast to the anime industry in the West, and a different beast to, say, the emerging anime industries in Saudi Arabia, in Malaysia, elsewhere in the world, and a different beast to the now 50-year-old anime industries in Europe. So all of those industries have their own reactions to Studio Ghibli. In the West, it's become a banker, which is just what it is in Japan. Ghibli is very bankable. Ghibli put bums on seats, and that's what a cinema chain particularly wants. But also, of course, in the West, particularly, the rise of home video and streaming has made Ghibli a kind of very personal pleasure. I mean, in Japan, when there's a new Ghibli film, until quite recently, you would go to a cinema and see it for the first time. You might go with your mates if you're in school or high school or going from work. You might go with your girlfriends if you're a gang of girls going out together. You might go with your family, your children, your grandchildren. But you will go and have that communal experience in the cinema. Very much so. Ghibli movies are event movies. Whereas over here, until quite recently, Ghibli movies were event movies on home media. and people would wait for the DVD to come out or the Blu-ray to come out, or now the streaming to come out, and then have watch parties over streaming, or get the Blu-ray and enjoy that. So there's a different impact. And Ghibli's an odd thing, because whereas most franchises are like One Piece is One Piece. It's one coherent series that wherever you sell it, whether you do it as figurines or as puzzles or as a computer game or as a musical, which I'm sure will come, or as the TV series itself in all the different forms, One Piece is one franchise. Ghibli is, I think, the first studio that's become a franchise in itself. And that's quite an interesting thing. That means that people buy things that relate to Ghibli, even if they don't necessarily like, or perhaps don't necessarily know, the film that thing relates to, because they see it and it's cute and it's got the Ghibli label on it and they want it.
Well, to speak of people like that, or maybe people who are a bit deeper into it, what to you is a Ghibli fan? Like, if someone says, "Oh, I'm a Ghibli fan," what does that mean to you?
Two things. It usually means that they have seen at least 2 or 3 of the more recent movies and have perhaps been inspired by that to seek out some of the earlier stuff. But a Ghibli fan is very difficult to quantify because they come in so many shapes, sizes and formats. I mean, for example, I know a number, and I meet them all over the country, of really rabid Ghibli fans, absolute fanatics for Ghibli, who have not seen the early classics of the 80s and early 90s. When you think about it, that's not irrational. I mean, a lot of people have come into Ghibli fandom since the early 2000s, and certainly since 2005 to 10, when broadband became much easier to get. So they've seen more of the recent films and less of the earlier films. But a Ghibli fan generally is someone who's seen at least 2 or 3 films, wants to seek them out, and is interested in acquiring other Ghibli knowledge or stuff. I mean, if we just generally call every acquisition that you make, whether it's of knowledge or stuff, Ghibli points, not all Ghibli fans are really into collecting all the Ghibli points, but most of them are into collecting quite a few of the Ghibli points. So lots of different types of Ghibli fan, any age from very, very young all the way up to 70s, 80s, 90s. Very often now moving with family or friend groups, so they come in mini packs, or I suppose we could say mini Totoro pods, 3 or 4 people together, a group of friends together, a family together. And they are very diverse as people. All sorts of people from all kinds of backgrounds just get Ghibli, and that's it.
Well, as you said, there are fans from very young all the way up to their 90s. But in your opinion, is there a specific age that someone should be to watch Ghibli films? An age where you think they'd maybe appreciate them more?
I think certainly the films that have a child protagonist are easier for small children. So if you take Totoro, Ponyo, Castle in the Sky, you've got 3 sets of children at different ages there, where you can see an obvious in for kids of those ages, because it is quite difficult for a very small child to watch a story that gives them no point of identification. And then as you move on, as you get to different stages in your life, other Ghiblis may come to appeal to you more. I mean, nothing has ever wiped out Totoro for me, but come ahead of Totoro for me. But I can see the charm of Porco Rosso, which is about a very young girl with a crush on a much older man who is to a certain extent crushing on her, but who is also obviously going to end up with the glamorous, marvellous woman from his past. For schoolgirls, that sort of thing is very interesting. If you look at Howl, that is an obvious wish fulfillment fantasy right in there, driving the whole story. There are films that I think children shouldn't watch without parental supervision. Because one of the things that parents tend to forget sometimes is that they actually know, or should know, their child better than anyone. You should know what intellectual and emotional stage your child is at. You should know what stories they can take and what stories they can't. You would need a parent on hand to explain all the ball gags in Pompoko, to say why it's perfectly okay to make jokes about testicles in this context, but you better not do it in school. So, you know, you actually do get to a stage where you need to be vigilant about children taking in even a Ghibli film. And I think that's true of even a Disney film, to be honest.
So, to stay on the topic of the fans, or more broadly the community, how would you say that the anime community has changed between when you started your work and now?
Oh, massively, massively, because now communication is easier. Technology has given us so much in that regard as fans. We can now communicate with fans all over the world in real time. I mean, you could have somebody hop in from this call from Australia if they were up at this minute, and it would be just as easy as if we were sitting in each other's living room. You can also, obviously, of course, stream things and download things, legally or illegally, at a rate that we couldn't even have imagined. So you have access to an anime library and a manga library, which is much, much bigger than anything we conceived of. But then when things came out on videotape, you could also curate your own library. And where we are now is that speeded up 500 times, where you can not only collect your favorite items and curate your own library, but do that in pretty much the same time scale as things actually appear in Japan. You can read the manga translated. You can download the manga. You can see the anime translated or subtitled, whichever you prefer. You might have to wait a little bit longer for the American dub to emerge, but it's not going to be that long these days. And that's the biggest difference in the community, because when anyone can talk about these things online, almost anyone has access to talk about these things online, it just becomes a much bigger community. And of course, that brings with it all sorts of different issues. Now, for example, a huge community in Saudi Arabia is opening up online. The same in China. Some of those people, for example, in some of the Arab world, will have very different views on what women should and shouldn't do in terms of working in media, working outside the home, having control. They'll probably be more like Japanese fans back in the late 60s, early 70s, when women could work in anime but could never get promoted to any job beyond key animator. So I think the Western anime community, it's not just us in Japan, it's us and a lot of other people.
See, that's interesting. I actually didn't know that it had grown as big as that into places like the Middle East. But to stick just broadly Western for now, I've seen people say before that Studio Ghibli opened up the West to anime. What would you say to that?
Well, we've got to define our terms here first. What do you mean by the West? Because the West was open to anime long before Ghibli was founded. Anime was screened in Britain in the 50s at the BFI. There's a really interesting timeline that a scholar called Leah Holmes put up that shows a remarkable amount of anime for the time being thrown around British culture in the 50s and 60s. Anime was screened in France from the mid-60s. Anime was screened in, or Japanese material was screened in Germany, Belgium, Italy, 70s onwards. There was a big awareness of anime. And I mean a big awareness of anime because it was on TV in large sections of the world past America and England. So America and England were late to the party. And what really opened up our little bit of the West to anime was Akira. There had been plenty of anime discussion before that and some anime around on TV before that, but Akira blew the doors off the van in anime terms. And the exploitation of Akira and the expectation of what anime could be after Akira was the first big game changer that opened the West to anime.
As you mentioned before, Ghibli has such a high standard and an excellent critical reception in most cases. So, do you think it's fair to say that Ghibli is treated differently by the average viewer than other animation studios? Like maybe they receive some sort of special treatment from audiences or critics? I
think that's very fair, and in fact, you can kind of reverse engineer that. My friend, the critic and author Andrew Osmond, once said that he thought that Tales from Earthsea would have had a far easier critical reception if it hadn't been made at Studio Ghibli by Goro Miyazaki. And I think he's right. I think the fact that the name Ghibli imposes a certain standard, and the fact that it's made by Miyazaki's son raises certain expectations. And I think therefore it's reasonable to say that some of the minor Ghibli films, had they been made outside Ghibli and by other directors, would have been given a far easier ride. So there is a difference in standard when you're talking about a Studio Ghibli film. You have expectations of a Studio Ghibli film. You have a clear idea of what a Studio Ghibli film should be. And that's great, because, I mean, you've got a clear idea of what a Makoto Shinkai film should be. You've got a clear idea of what a Masaaki Yuasa film should be. But they seem to have more, individual directors seem to have more room to play within their brand than Ghibli does. Perhaps that's because Miyazaki and Takahata have been so important and so influential that they've made the studio feel monolithic. And so we view it as just a brand. We don't talk about a Goro Miyazaki film or a Hiromasa Yonebayashi film, we talk about a Studio Ghibli film. And that is a marketing concept that the public has absorbed wholeheartedly. So I think it's partly because those two, and in particular Takahata, really were considered widely within Japan as people who had gone beyond mere animation and taken on the qualities of proper film, grown-up film, in their work.
So if we take a look forward now, Studio Ghibli has films, merchandise, stage plays, museums, all sorts of different stuff. So if you had to make a guess, what's next?
Well, the question, of course, is anything going to be next? Ghibli now is a wholly owned subsidiary of NTV, Nihon Terebi. Good reasons for that. As Suzuki pointed out, he's over 75, Miyazaki's over 83. They're not going to be around forever, and there are 200 people near enough who rely on Studio Ghibli for a paycheck. So putting it into the envelope of a big company that's well-resourced is a way of safeguarding those people. Now, when a studio buys another studio, they're usually looking to get something very specific out of it. What NTV has acquired with Ghibli is a top-end, high-end studio that could make any program and make it really well. What it hasn't acquired are any of the directors that made that studio run. Takahata's dead. Goro, Suzuki, God love him, sent him off to make Earwig and the Witch at a totally separate studio in CGI. Because Goro, Suzuki said quite sensibly, Goro needs to be away from his father's studio doing his own thing for a while. So whether Goro will stay with Ghibli is another matter. He might well come back to direct for Ghibli on NTV-helmed projects. It's possible that NTV could let selected directors make projects with Ghibli as part of, I don't know, a new version of the World Masterpiece Theatre, perhaps. Might say to directors, come to us and make a film or make a series with the Studio Ghibli team. But the longer it goes on without Ghibli having a specific project, the more easy it is for those very well trained, very talented, well-connected individuals in the studio to drift off to other areas of anime, because right now, anime can't get enough people. Anime is absolutely booming. It's desperate for people. And when you have this great resource sitting there, wonderfully trained, wonderfully equipped, obviously expensive, which is a drawback because anime still pays really badly, but it's hard not to look at Miyazaki's various retirements and how people drifted in and out and back to the studio and think, if he doesn't get this film that he's working on now off the ground, and he is 83, there are limits to what anyone can do at that age. If this film doesn't go anywhere, how long will the best talent stick with Ghibli? You've got to ask yourself that. So I think the glass is too murky to say what's next. I think it's quite possible that Studio Ghibli will simply dissolve and fall apart. But what I would like to see happen is that idea of NTV putting out a call to all the directors out there and saying, come here and make a really exciting, really innovative film for us using the Studio Ghibli team. Really, show what you can do. With one of the greatest instruments ever created for the making of animation. And that, I think, would be very exciting and very hopeful.
I think it'll be interesting to see where the future takes it. As a fan, obviously I hope that there's more, but as you said, at 83 there's only so much one man can do. But to end us off, looking even further ahead, what do you think will be the long-term overall legacy? What is the legacy of Studio Ghibli going to be?
I think there are two things. I think there's an actual physical legacy, which we see every time an animation studio breaks up. We saw it when Mushi Pro collapsed, when Tezuka went bankrupt. We see it every time something happens to dissolve a studio. A large number of very gifted people with a strong lineage, with a direct connection, in this case, back to Yasuo Otsuka, the greatest animator who ever lived, and back to the people who trained him, the unbelievable Kenji Masaoka. We are looking at that talent moving out into the Animagene pool. When that happened at Mushi Pro, directors like Rintaro, people like Tomino, people who'd worked for Tezuka, took that experience out into the world. And what happened there is that they inspired yet more people who followed on from them to do brilliant work. We wouldn't have had Akira without Tetsujin 28, and we wouldn't have had Tetsujin 28 if that, I've forgotten the name of the guy who made it, but we wouldn't have had Tetsujin 28 if the creator hadn't been inspired by reading a Tezuka manga in his childhood. We wouldn't have had Utena without Rose of Versailles, and without Tezuka going to Takarazuka in his childhood, we wouldn't have Rose of Versailles. So these things get handed down all the way from Tezuka at Takarazuka, a little boy watching a glamorous show with his mum, to Princess Knight, to Rose of Versailles, to Utena. The repercussions of Ghibli's legacy will play out in the people that Ghibli has trained and the people that Ghibli has worked with and inspired. You're already seeing some of it in directors like Sunao Katabuchi and Mamoru Hosoda, both of whom were fired from Ghibli, both of whom took that experience and went on to make their own great films. The other legacy, I think, is the legacy of the films themselves, that the films themselves will inspire readings and rereadings, not just in terms of fans and how fans interpret them, but also in terms of how directors interpret different types of story. Ghibli's films have overwhelmingly, if you look at the average across all of them, been about two things: being Japanese, and being Japanese in a Japan heavily influenced by Western mythology. All Miyazaki's addiction to translated British and European children's books that comes through so strongly in Ghibli, that will continue to impact Japanese animation. All Takahata's determination to talk about being working class in Japan, that's going to impact Japanese animation. So I think those legacies, the legacy of the films themselves and what impact they have on others, and the legacy of the workers themselves and what they take forward from the Ghibli experience, that's going to go very far into the future. I mean, Tezuka's been dead since 1989. So we're now, coming up on 30 years after Tezuka. And his influence is still working through. I think when we get to 2050, we'll be in a much better position to assess Ghibli's influence. I would like to say I'm going to be here to do that, but obviously I can't commit to that at this stage. But I think when the next generation of scholars and historians looks back on the impact of Ghibli, they'll have more to work with, and that's going to be great fun. I hope I'm around to read it, even if not to write it.
Alright, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Animagination podcast. Huge thanks to my guest Helen McCarthy for joining me and deep diving into the world of Studio Ghibli. Ghibli is one of those franchises you can talk about for hours and still barely scratch the surface. To all you listeners out there, whether you're in your first film or you've been a Ghibli head for years, we'd love to hear your favourite Ghibli moments. Hit us up on our socials and let us know. Anyway, thanks for tuning in to the Animagination podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your anime-loving friends. Next week, we're switching gears to talk about anime from a different angle, so stay tuned for that. Until then, keep dreaming big, moving forward, and exploring the world of anime. I'm Cameron, this has been Animagination, and I'll see you next time.